I shall now show both why it is that believers may fall into such a condition, and also why it is that oftentimes they actually do so. Why is it that believers may be brought into depths on account of sin? First, the nature of the covenant in which all believers now walk with God, and wherein all their whole provision for obedience is enwrapped, leaves it possible for them to fall into these depths that have been mentioned. Under the first covenant, there was no mercy or forgiveness provided for any sin. It was necessary then that it should exhibit a sufficiency of grace to preserve them from every sin, or it could have been of no use at all. This the righteousness of God required, and so it was. To have made a covenant wherein there was no provision at all of pardon, and not a sufficiency of grace to keep the covenanters from need of pardon, was not answerable to the goodness and righteousness of God. But he made man upright, who of his own accord sought out many inventions. It is not so in the covenant of grace. There is in it pardon provided in the blood of Christ. It is not therefore of indispensable necessity that there should be administered in its grace effectually preserving from every sin. Yet it is on all accounts to be preferred before the other. For besides a relief by pardon which the other knew nothing of, there is in it also much provision against sin which was not in the other. Number 1. There is a provision made in it against all and every sin that would disannul the covenant and make a final separation between God and a soul that has been once taken into the bond of it. This provision is absolute. God has taken it upon himself, the making of this good, and the establishing this law of the covenant, that it shall not by any sin be disannulled. Jeremiah 32, verse 40. I will, God says, make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me. The security of this depends not on anything in ourselves. All that is in us is to be used as a means of the accomplishment of this promise. But the event or issue depends absolutely on the faithfulness of God, and the whole certainty and stability of the covenant depends on the efficacy of the grace administered in it to preserve man from all such sins that would disannul it. Number 2, there is in this covenant provision made for constant peace and consolation, notwithstanding and against the guilt of such sins as, through their infirmities and temptations, believers are daily exposed to. Though they fall into sins every day, yet they do not fall into these depths every day. In the tenor of this covenant there is a consistency between a sense of sin unto humiliation and peace with strong consolation. After the apostle had described the whole conflict that believers have with sin, and the frequent wounds which they receive thereby, which makes them cry out for deliverance, Romans 7 verse 24, he yet concludes chapter 8 verse 1 that there is no condemnation to them, which is a sufficient and stable foundation of peace. So 1 John 2 verse 1. These things I write unto you, that you do not sin. And if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. Our great business and care ought to be that we do not sin. But yet, when we have done our utmost, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. Chapter 1, verse 8. What then shall poor sinful, guilty creatures do? Well, let them go to the Father by their advocate, and they shall not fail of pardon and peace. And Paul says, Hebrews 6, verses 17 and 18, God is abundantly willing that we might have strong consolation, who fly for refuge to lay hold on the hope set before us. What was his condition who fled of old to the city of refuge for safety, from whence this expression is taken? He was guilty of blood, though shed at unawares, and so is that he was to die for it, if he escape not to the city of refuge. That we may have the guilt of sins upon us that the law pronounces death too. Yet, flying to Christ for refuge, God has promised not only safety, but strong consolation for us also. Forgiveness in the blood of Christ does not only take guilt from the soul, but troubles also the conscience. And in this respect, as the apostle at large set forth the excellency of his sacrifice, Hebrews 10. The sacrifices of the old law, he tells us, could not make perfect the worshippers, verse 1, which he proves, verse 2, because they did never take away thoroughly and really conscience of sin, that is, depths or distresses of conscience about sin. But now he says, Jesus Christ, in the covenant of grace, has perfected forever them that are sanctified, verse 14, provided for them such stable peace and consolation as that they shall not need the renewing of sacrifices every day, verse 18. This is a great mystery of the gospel and the blood of Christ, that those who sin every day should have peace with God all their days, provided their sins fall within the compass of those infirmities against which this consolation is provided. Number 3. There is provision made of grace to prevent and preserve the soul from great and enormous sins, such as in their own nature are apt to wound conscience and cast a person into such depths and entanglements as wherein he shall have neither rest nor peace. Of what sort these sins are shall be afterward declared. There is in this covenant grace for grace, John 1, verse 16, and abundance of grace administered from the all fullness of Christ. Grace reigns in it. Romans 6, verse 6, destroying and crucifying the body of sin. But this provision in the covenant of grace against peace, ruining, so perplexing sins as not as to the administration of it absolute. Their covenant commands and exhortations on the attendants, in which the administration of much covenant grace depends, to watch, pray, improve faith, to stand on our guard continually, to mortify sin, to fight against temptations with steadfastness, diligence, constancy, are everywhere prescribed to us, and that in order to the insurance of the grace mentioned, these things are on our part the condition of the administration of that abundant grace which is to preserve us from soul-entangling sins. So Peter informs us in the second epistle, chapter 1, verse 3, the divine power of God is given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. We have from it an habitual furnishment and provision for obedience at all times. Also, he says in verse 4, he has given to us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these we might be partakers of the divine nature. What then is in this blessed estate and condition required of us, that we may make a due improvement to the provision made for us, and enjoy the comforting influence of those promises that he prescribes to us, verses 5 and 7. Given all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. That is, carefully and diligently attend to the exercise of all the graces of the Spirit, and to a conversation in all things becoming the gospel. What then shall be the issue if the things are attended to? Verse 8, if the things be in you, and abound, to make you that you shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is not enough that these things be in you, that you have the seed and root of them from and by the Holy Ghost, but you are to take care that they flourish and abound, without which, though the root of the matter may be in you, and so you be not wholly devoid of spiritual life, yet you will be poor, barren, sapless, withering creatures all your days. But now, suppose that these things do abound, and we be made fruitful thereby. Why then, he says in verse 10, if you do these things, you shall never fall. What? Never fall into sin? No, that is not in the promise. And he that says when he has done all that he has no sin, he is a liar. Or is it he never fall totally from God? No, the preservation of the elect of whom he speaks from total apostasy is not suspended on such conditions, especially not in any degree of them, such as their abounding imports, but it is that they shall not fall into their old sins from which they were purged. Verse 9. Such conscience-wasting and defiling sins as they lived in the time and state of their unregeneracy, or before they were born again. Thus, though there be in the covenant of grace, through Jesus Christ, provision made of abundant supplies for the soul's preservation from entangling sins, yet their administration has respect to our diligent attendance to the means of receiving them appointed for us to walk in. And here lies the latitude of the new covenant. Here lies the exercise of renewed free will. This is a field of free voluntary obedience under the administration of gospel grace. There are extremes which, in respect of the event, it is not concerned in. To be wholly perfect, to be free from every sin, all failings, all infirmities, that is not provided for. That is not promised in this covenant. It is a covenant of mercy and pardon which supposes the continuance of sin. To fall utterly and finally from God, that is absolutely provided against. Between these two extremes of absolute perfection and total apostasy lies the large field of believers' obedience and walking with God. Many a sweet heavenly passage there is, and many a dangerous depth in this field. Some walk near to the one side, some to the other. Yea, the same person may sometimes press hard after perfection, sometimes be cast to the very border of destruction. Now, between these two are many a soul-plunging sin against which no absolute provision is made, and which, for lack of giving all diligence to put the means of preservation in practice, believers are oftentimes overtaken with. Number 4. There is not in the covenant of grace provision made of ordinary and abiding consolation for any under the guilt of great sins, or sins greatly aggravated which they fall into by a neglect of using and abiding in the aforementioned conditions of abounding actual grace. Sins there are which, either because in their own nature they wound and waste conscience, or in their effects break forth into scandal, causing the name of God and the gospel to be evil spoken of, or in some of their circumstances are full of unkindness against God. These deprive the soul of its wanted consolation. How by what means, on what account such sins come to terrify conscience, to break the bones, to darken the soul and to cast it into inextricable depths, notwithstanding the relief that is provided of pardon in the blood of Christ. I shall not now declare that they will do so, and the consolation is not of equal extent with safety, we know. Hence God assumes it to himself as an act of mere sovereign grace to speak peace and refreshment to the souls of his saints in their depths of sin entanglements. Isaiah 57:18 and 19. And indeed, if the Lord had not thus provided that great provocation should stand in need of spiritual reliefs, it might justly be feared that the negligence of believers might possibly bring forth much bitter fruit. Only this must be observed, by the way, that what is spoken relates to the sins of sinners and their own souls, and not to the nature of the thing itself. There is in the gospel consolation provided against the greatest as well as the least sins. The difference arises from God's sovereign communication of it, according to the tenor of the covenant's administration which we have laid down. Hence, because under Moses' law there was an exception made of some sin for which there was no sacrifice appointed, so that those who were guilty of them could no way be justified from them, that is, carnally, as to their entrance in the Judaical church and polity. Paul tells the Jews in Acts 13:38 and 39 that through Jesus Christ was preached to them the forgiveness of sins, and that by him all that believe are justified from all things from which they could not be justified by the law of Moses. There is now no exception of any particular sins as to pardon and peace, But what we have spoken relates to the manner and way in which God is pleased to administer consolation to the souls of sinning believers. And this is the evidence which I shall offer to prove that the souls of believers, after much gracious communion with God, may yet fall into inextricable depths on the account of sin. And this is why they actually oftentimes do so. And this shall be further declared. The principles of this assertion are known, and I shall therefore only touch upon them first. The nature of indwelling sin, as it remains in the best of the saints in this life, being a little considered, will evidence unto us from whence it is that they are sometimes surprised and plunge into the depths mentioned. For number 1, though the strength of every sin be weakened by grace, yet the root of no sin is in this life wholly taken away. Lust is like the stubborn Canaanites, who after the general conquest of the land would dwell in it still. Joshua 17 verse 12. Indeed, when Israel grew strong, they brought them under tribute, but they could not utterly expel them. The kingdom and rule belongs to grace, and when it grows strong it brings sin much under, but it will not be wholly driven out. The body of death is not utterly to be done away, but in and by the death of the body. In the flesh of the best saints there dwells no good thing, Romans 7 verse 18. But the contrary is there, that is, the root of all evil. The flesh lusts against the spirit, as the spirit lusts against the flesh, Galatians 5 verse 17. As then there is a universality in the actings of the spirit in its opposing all evil, so also there is a universality in the actings of the flesh for the furtherance of it. Number 2, some lust or remains of original corruption obtain in some person such advantages, either from nature, custom, employment, society, or the like circumstances, that they become like the Canaanites that had iron chariots. It is a very difficult thing to subdue them. Well, it is as if war is maintained constantly against them, for they will almost always be in actual rebellion. Number 3, indwelling sin, though weakened, retains all of its properties. The properties of a thing follow its nature. Where the nature of anything is, there are all in its natural properties. What these properties are of indwelling sin I should here declare, but that I have handled the whole power and efficacy, the nature and properties of it, in a treatise to that only purpose. That treatise is called a treatise on indwelling sin, and it has been narrated a number of times, and is at the narrated Puritan at sermonaudio.com, but I continue. In brief, they are such as it is no wonder that some believers are by them cast into depths, but it is indeed that they escape them. But thereof the reader may see at large my discourse on this particular subject. Secondly, add to this the power and prevalency of temptation, which because also I have already in a special discourse to that purpose insisted on, I shall not here further lay open. Thirdly, the sovereign pleasure of God in dealing with sinning saints must also be considered. Divine love and wisdom does not work towards all in the same manner. God is pleased to continue peace to some with a non-obstinate for great provocations. Love shall humble them, and rebukes of kindness shall recover them from their wanderings. Others he is pleased to bring into the depths we have spoken of. But yet I may generally say, signal provocations meet with one of these two events from God. First, those in whom they are left into some signal barrenness and fruitfulness in their generations. They shall wither, grow barren, worldly, sapless, and be much cast out of the hearts of the people of God. Or secondly, they shall be exercised in these depths from whence their way of deliverance is laid down in this psalm. Thus I say God deals with his saints in great variety. Some shall have all their bones broken, when others shall have only the gentle strokes of the rod. We are in the hand of mercy, and he may deal with us as seems good to him. But for our parts, great sins ought to be attended with expectations of great depths and perplexities. And this is the state of the soul proposed in the psalm, and biased to consideration. These are depths in which it is entangled. These are the ways and means whereby it is brought into these depths. Its deportment in and under this state and condition lies next underway. But before I proceed to that, I shall annex some few things to what has been delivered, tending to the further opening of the whole case before us, and they are: number 1, what are, or of what sort those sins are, which usually cast the souls of believers into depths, and then number 2, insist on some aggravations of them,